Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 16th, 2022. I'm going to begin with a very brief update and then go into questions because there were many useful questions sent in to me for the Friday question session. Let me just start by saying that the war drive is continuing from the West. President Biden has once again pledged more money to arm the Ukrainians. Another I think 600 million, bringing the total in the last months to 16 billion. At the same time, there's more provocations as well against China. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed something called the Taiwan Policy Act of 2022. And what this declares is that Taiwan must be treated as a major non-NATO ally. In other words, defense protection given to Taiwan against China. Now, this is putting the United States on the verge of a two-front war. The NATO escalation in Ukraine against Russia, and now an escalation against China around Taiwan, creates a situation which U.S. military officials have said, we're not prepared for a two-front war. Well, the warmongers in both parties in the House and Senate are pushing for a two-front war with the backing of Biden and most of the Republicans. So this is part of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche called the self-inflicted damage from Western countries. Now, this includes the economic crisis, the use of the Green New Deal to shut down efficient energy supplies and move toward inefficient, so-called sustainable sources, the sanctions policy, which is cutting off flow of oil to the West, oil and gas, and the quantitative easing policies supposedly to protect the economy following the COVID shutdowns, and now the use of high interest rates, which cuts off credit to what's left of industry and small business. Now, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said in her keynote address at last weekend's conference is that the US and Europe are collapsing as a result of self-inflicted policies. And she said, this shows that they favor Malthus over LaRouche, referring to Lyndon LaRouche's approach, which is to shut down the speculative economy and fund the physical economy, in contrast to Malthus, who argued at the time of the American Revolution that there are too many people. There's not enough food production or resource production, and therefore people will have to die. Now, this comes to my first question. Someone just asked, what do you mean by Malthusian? It's the policies of Malthus, the British Empire. Malthus worked for the British East India Company. And what they argued is that the government should not spend money to help poor people. They should not clear stagnant ponds because they spread disease, which is useful to cull the herd. This is the exact language that we saw from groups like the Club of Rome in the 60s, from Prince Philip, the former husband of Queen Elizabeth. This is what Prince Charles believes. This is what the World Economic Forum is pushing. The Green New Deal. Cut back on efficient energy, which will leave much of the world without enough energy and electricity to sustain the existing population. That's Malthusianism. And that is the policy that's embedded in the Green New Deal, the so-called anti-inflation policy of Biden, the European Union's Green Deal, and so on. And that's why people in Europe are bracing for a freezing cold winter with inadequate electricity, inadequate warmth, inadequate fuel, and inadequate food. So the next question I have came from Nicole, who asked, is it a good thing for nations to break from the central banker's fiat currency, that is from the dollar system? And she referred in specific to African countries with the discussion of a gold-backed currency. Well, this has been in the works for a while. This is something that Gaddafi was talking about, which is one of the reasons he was targeted for murder and regime change. The question is not so much gold per se, but physical economy. The policies of the International Monetary Fund are designed to protect the private bankers. That is, to make sure that nations which can't afford to pay the debt or the interest on the debt can be loaned money, which of course increases their debt, to make sure they stay current on existing debt. But that means there's nothing left over, not only for investment in new physical processes, but not enough left over to sustain the existing population. That's Malthusianism. Nations in Africa, as well as most of the global south, the former non-aligned movement, the BRICS countries and others, are moving away from that. And they're looking at options for what can be done to move away from the control of currency and credit by the dollar system into some form of local or regional or block trading that can at least enable them to sustain their population. So it's a good thing, but it has to go all the way to LaRouche's idea of a new Bretton Woods proposal, and you can find that on our websites. And if they want to develop a fully self-sufficient economy, which includes industry, which includes modern agriculture, which includes modern healthcare system, they have to break with the existing system. Now, the second question is from Will Robinson, who asks, if the Saudis ditch the dollar and move toward the BRICS, will this be game over for the dollar? Well, in a sense, it's game over for the dollar system, not necessarily the dollar. But it's not just the Saudis. It's a move by many, many nations that are working together around projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Pakistan Economic Corridor. There are all kinds of regional and local development projects which can't be funded under the existing system because it's not going to protect the over-indebted Western banks to do so. So if countries wish to develop, they have to go outside of it, as I just mentioned in answering Nicole's question. Whether the Saudis ditch it or not remains to be seen. What's the final phase? What will bring the system down? I think most importantly is there has to be a move from the United States and or Europe to acknowledge this system is bankrupt. It's not working. We have to move to something new. And that will only come from public pressure. The bankers are not going to allow it. The existing political networks who are so wedded to the global corporate cartels based on needing money for their campaigns and the support from their controlled media, they're not going to break with it. It's going to require a mobilization in the population to demand a break with this system. That's up to you. It's up to our viewers and your friends to educate them on this alternate trend which is emerging, which is a solution to what is otherwise an unsolvable problem. Now, R. Landon asked, what about the move to central bank digital currencies? Can this be avoided? Well, of course it can be avoided. The whole idea of giving central banks more control over what will essentially be another form of fiat currency is an absurd idea. Now, whether that means digital currencies themselves are worthless, that's another question. But the idea of central banks having control over that would simply be another way of giving them more power to determine where credit is going. As Lyndon LaRouche always insisted, the question is not that government should cut off credit because of fear of inflation, but should direct credit. And this goes back to the work done by LaRouche's mentor, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, in the late 17th, early 18th century, with the idea of physical economy. And you can find LaRouche's writings on this just Google it, LaRouche on Leibniz. But the idea is that a credit system is necessary, but there must be a direction to it as opposed to leaving it in the hands of the so-called private or free market, where it will always flow into the areas that will produce the most short-term wealth for those who control the money, as opposed to directed for the general welfare of sovereign nations. So the whole question of digital currencies, in my way of thinking, is somewhere off in the distance, but the attempt to have a central bank-controlled digital currency system would just be an extension of the present fiat money system. Now, the question from Chris, isn't Putin with the World Economic Forum? Doesn't the World Economic Forum support the war in Ukraine? The World Economic Forum supports the Ukrainian side, but the idea that's out there on the internet that China and Russia are in on the World Economic Forum plan for the Great Reset is a complete fraud. Look at the media controlled by the World Economic Forum and the City of London and the Schwabites in Davos. It's anti-Russia. It's anti-China. It's anti-physical production. It's against sovereign nation states. And what the Russians are mobilizing for, what the Chinese are mobilizing for, and what most of the rest of the world wants is a guarantee of security for a sovereign nation state which can act in the interests of its population and not be held accountable to a global banking and financial cartel. So Putin and China are targeted, as I mentioned at the very beginning, targeted by these financial networks. And for people to spread this word that, well, Putin he once addressed the World Economic Forum. Of course he did. He addressed many Western forums, including the Munich Security Council, trying to get a reasonable guarantee for Russian national security. That doesn't mean he sold out to the World Economic Forum. The policies of Russia and China are investment in new energy technologies, including clean coal, including development of nuclear fusion, including building nuclear plants all over Africa. This goes against the World Economic Forum plan. So I wish people would study this instead of just grabbing on to these little tidbits that say, well, Putin addressed them or Xi Jinping addressed Davos, therefore he's with Davos. That's like saying, well, it's a fraudulent, sophistical construction. The reality is that there's a division in the world today between those governments which submit to the authority of central banks and those which say that central banks should be servants of the interests of a sovereign nation, or there shouldn't be central banks, private central banks. So that's the division between what we're seeing emerge as a potential for a new financial system and the existing collapsing fiat money system. So I hope that answers the question and that people will take that seriously. Now, finally, I have a question that interested me a lot from RJ, who said, I notice you display different books. What books would you suggest reading for those wishing to learn more? Well, as you can see, I'm surrounded by books. I've always loved reading, especially history, drama, culture, books about geography, and so on. But I think if you want a full answer, it's more than I could give you in this moment. But let me say, if you're interested in a method of getting to truth, start with books by Lyndon LaRouche. And on economics, I would suggest So You Wish to Learn About Economics or The Science of Christian Economy, two books that should be required reading of anybody who wishes to study economics. Also, LaRouche has a number of other writings on strategic matters, and you can look for the LaRouche Legacy Foundation and the Digital Library of LaRouche, which was presented at our conference last Sunday. And you can watch that conference on schillerinstitute.com and get a sense of what's available for the LaRouche Library. Now, in history, I'd recommend on American history, Graham Lowry's wonderful book, How the Nation Was Won, which gives you an insight into why the United States had to break with Great Britain, with the British Empire, with the East India Company, and what were the policies behind what became, or the idea behind what became the Hamiltonian economic policy, which built the United States as an independent sovereign nation. I mean, there are a number of books on the history of World War I, for example. Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, is a good one. Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August is very interesting reading. On the British Empire, there are many books, most of which are misleading because they lead you to believe the empire ended. But if you want to see what the method of the empire was, which hasn't ended, it's just been assimilated by the Anglophile American leadership, take a look at Peter Hopkirk's book, The Great Game. Another very useful book is Stephen Cohen's book, The War with Russia. In terms of the role of what we know as the so-called deep state, you can look at Stephen Kinzer's book, The Brothers, James Douglas has a very interesting book on Kennedy called JFK and the Unspeakable. And finally, let me go back to what I said earlier, that drama is crucial, and especially tragic drama, to get an understanding of how some of the greatest thinkers look at history from the standpoint that the tragedy is not that of the so-called tragic hero, but of the beliefs accepted in general by the society. That is popular opinion. And for that, you have wonderful material from the ancient Greeks, especially from Aeschylus. Shakespeare's tragedies, as well as his histories of the English kings, are absolutely essential if you want to understand the fight that was going on inside England in the 16th century to fulfill the promise of the Tudor victory over Richard III and what existed before that. So the Shakespeare English histories are absolutely wonderful for that. And then the works of Friedrich Schiller, both his tragedies, Don Carlos, but let me recommend as well his writings on aesthetics, which will give you a sense of how Schiller understood what education should be, what's necessary to develop the character of a people so they cannot be fooled by disinformation coming from the so-called mainstream media, and how to steel yourself against popular opinion. So there's much more I could say on this, but let me stop at that. I would urge people to go to our website and read what we're posting daily and circulate it and help us build a movement now while there's still an opportunity which is dwindling as we move into what could be a cold, dark winter.